So, dear colleagues, great to be here and thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward this coming days and in the program there are a lot of promising presentations and I really want to thank the organizers, in particular Maite and Maria José, for inviting me and to taking care of me and I think of everyone, so thank you very much. In this keynote today, I want to raise the question on the field of media and gender and sexuality. Is the study of gender, sexuality and media a field of its own? Does it has its own theory, conceptualizations, paradigms, and research methods? What connects us? That's the question I want to raise this morning. So, and I would never thought I would start the keynote with the concept of Pierre Bourdieu, but I do. And, it's a rather old sociological notion, but I think in a way it's a good entry point to start thinking about the field of gender, sexuality and media. What is it that connects us? Distinction, as you probably know, is a concept out of the work La Distinction, a work from 1979 of Pierre Bourdieu. It's a seminal work of Bourdieu where he argues that those with high social and cultural capital or status are the arbiters of taste, and that one's own particular taste comes from the milieu or the social class in which one lives, that is one's field. So an individual's almost initiate knowledge of how to live and navigate that field is what Bourdieu called and termed the habitus. It is a concept which refers to the activity of distancing of one social class from another, embedded in differences in tastes. The notion of distinction is linked to the concept of capital, social capital, but in the book he also talks about economic capital and cultural capital. And the definition which is used, and it's a definition I think from the mid-80s, Bourdieu says the form of capital, and I quote, it's also on the slide, the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to position of the durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acceptance and recognition, or in other words, to membership in a group which provides each of its members with the backing of a collective-owned capital, a credential which entitles them to credit in the various sense of the word. It is in this practice of distancing, of distinction, which is used, which I will use as a lens to look at the field of gender, sexuality, and media studies. What is the distinction? And, of course, the question, is there a distinction? First, I want to stress the importance of the research on gender, sexuality, and media, especially in contemporary context around the world, including Europe. The beginning of the 21st century is sadly marked by the emergence of geographical spread of anti-gender movements in Europe and Latin America. This movement rallies against LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, gender equality, sex and gender education, gender studies, and democracy at large. When looking at the EU, for example, their presence is most visible in Eastern Europe, whether by organizing referendums, preventing the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, or holding large protests, the anti-gender movement seems to have generated successful outcomes. These mass protests on the streets, but also online, are centralized around the so-called gender theory or gender ideology. It is explained by the very notion of gender is in fact a hidden plan, and I quote, of radical feminists and LGBTQI activists. It is seen as a new time of Marxism aiming a cultural revolution, a post-binary gender world. Gender theory, in this sense, has become an empty signifier, an all-inclusive mobilizing tool used by various religious or other groups, political parties, neoconservative social movements, and even state establishments to prevent equal policies from being adopted and implemented. It is in this context that the study of gender sexuality in media from an academic perspective become even more so important. And if you ask me, there is even a sense of emergency. So it's good that we are here. But what do we do, and what is our connection, and is there a connection? We do all have an important story to tell, but is there a general storyline? What is our narrative? What is the field of gender, sexuality, and media? Work on gender and media has a long, rich history, which, as you all know, coincides with feminist movements. True academic work on media came into existence as early as the rise of media, but was ignorant towards gender. From the late 1960s onwards, some scholars showed great interest in women as a topic of research. This as a result of the male bias in research until that point in time. As Lisbeth van Zoone argues in her book Feminist Media Studies, this is because the topic was raised by feminists, that some topics were studied by feminist scholars. The work was mostly on three distinctive themes. Firstly, on stereotypes and social roles. Secondly, on ideologies. And thirdly, on pornography. And each of them has a specific tie with feminism. For example, the study of this kind of advertisement, focusing as the first one sort of illustrates representations of women and femininity in relation to gender roles. Or, as the second could illustrate, in relation to beauty standards and how beauty standards are represented in all kinds of media outlets. This trend of research is inspired by the thought that through the underrepresentation and stereotypical representation of women, in this case in media, female audiences lack positive role models on which to model their behavior. Think about the work of Tuchman, for example. Over the years, there has been an enormous number of studies devoted to this theme, and it opens up the question of representation of gender, studying representation of femininities and masculinities, and later with an inclusion of the representation of LGBTQI+, and lately the intersection of different identities. And over the years, two strands have been developed. First, on the study of representation of gender in all kinds of news media, and secondly, on the representation of gender in advertising and popular media. Some journals, like Sexualities, have devoted to this kind of research. The second theme has to do with ideology. And the tie with feminist activism is slightly different. It is part of the cultural media studies tradition, and the studies who critically looks at media as agents of the so-called ruling class. It refers to the work of Althusser. Scholarly work also draw on the concept of hegemony to stress the consent in relation to the subordination. Here, ideology is translated into a common sense assumptions, and the naturalization of power relations. It started with the work of, for example, Angela McRobbie, Charlotte Brunston, Dorothy Hobson, with their work on gender and media from a cultural studies perspective. The journal Feminist Media Studies is an example of this trend of research, and most academic work focus on media text and their audiences. For example, the study of McRobbie on girls, culture, and feminism in the teens magazines, as you can see on the slide, just 17, where the romantic narrative has disappeared and some kind of agency around love and sex has been introduced. The final theme in the beginning of the study of gender and media is pornography. In the beginning and in general, pornography was considered to objectify women. Women as object of male desires and women not as active sexual agents. As this quote of Robin Morgan, it's a quote from 1977, illustrates where she says, pornography is a theory, rape is the practice. It's a radical interpretation where pornography is seen as a form of creating inequalities, exploitation, and subordination of mostly women. Underlying these arguments, the assumption that media texts have effects on behavior. We now know that it's not that simple, and recently, for example, through the work of Susanna Pazzone, we know that porn consumption is diverse and the relation between pornographic media texts and consumption of porn is complicated. Recent interest in pornification made it a renewed strand in research. And it now it's a field on its own, porn studies, with also an academic journal. So, but what is the narrative? The common denominator in this short history, or better, the early roots of what we now call media and gender studies, and with later the inclusion of sexuality, is the object of study. The commonality is the object, and mostly in the material sense. Media or mediated communication or communication at large in relation to gender and sexuality. So is the study of gender and sexuality as an object of study in relation to media sufficient to be a field? Is this the distinction, or is there more? The object of study is, of course, also closely linked to the way we study it. From the so-called body count of research, questioning who is presented, to the way how these representations are gendered, to unraveling the subject positions in media text. It's all about representation. But the object is not only the media text or representation, but also everything which comes before the text, the production of media. Again, a diversity of research, from questioning who is producing and creating what, to the study of inequalities in the media industry, looking for patterns from a more structural way of seeing, to recently focusing on the invisible, free and emotional labor of content creators in digital media. The object in all this kind of research is related to production, but also the consumption of media in relation to gender and sexuality is an object of study. Again, from questioning who is consuming what, to gendered and queer pleasures of audiences and the queering of text by audiences, or the creation of fan fiction, or the question of agency and resistance, to research on feminism and LGBTQI activism online, or research on girls and empowerment in relation to gender. What they all have in common is the object of study, but not so much the epistemology, nor the research method used, from affect paradigms to social constructivism to recently the use of affect theory. But the distinction is also, I think, made by something else, the position of the study in relation to the practice of othering. All the research in the field relates to the question of how a group, an identity, or a combination of identities relate to the dominant group, the dominant identity, or the dominant combination of identity, which is white, middle class, abled, middle-aged, heterosexual, cis men. This focus has all to do with the absence of the other, or to put it in a more nuanced way, the limited presence of the other. Right from the beginning, this is the core of feminist studies and of the study of gender and media. And as this quote illustrates, this absence and the study of absence is the core as one of the first research group in Birmingham group, the Women's Studies group at the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, where they argue, and I quote again, "It is through the questions that feminism poses and the absences it locates that feminist research and women's studies are constituted as one aspect of struggle for the transformation of society, which would make women's study unnecessary." So the object, the focus on other and othering, is often materialized by the default of absence. The practice of othering is a practice where norms are defined by what they are not, as Michel Foucault has taught us, and it's both by defining and excluding precisely what the norm is not, that the norm is created. In this process of othering, the definition and the excluding everything that is the norm isn't. In relation to gender, this translates in the following structure. In short, the norm cis men is defined by excluding everything which is not, trans men, non-binary people, trans and cis women, etc. They are othered. The norm is clear. The white, able-bodied, heterosexual cis men, and those who do not fit into the norm are defined as the object or the other. He is the subject, the absolute, and he is essential. The other is positioned against this as not essential. However, when we're talking about the others, we see that they are not just defined as the other, but as solely being the other, as Simone de Beauvoir said in 1949 already. And the intersubjective differences are disregarded. In other words, the othering erases all diversity of differences, and the focus on the other is also a commonality and therefore a distinction. This is what we do. We study othering. It is also unavoidable that we also need to talk about identity. In this process of the study of the other, in all its diversities, identity is there. It's all over the place. And I think this quote of bell hooks sort of illustrates the connection well. When bell hooks says, we keep coming back to the question of representation because identity is always about representation. This is also another distinction. In all of our work, identities are there, being studied, underlining the process of research, and even sometimes as an outcome of the research. I think it's needless to say that an intersectional approach is also needed, but I understood that tomorrow there will be a keynote on an intersectional approach. So looking forward to hear all about it tomorrow. But all of these identities became situated, embodied, related to subject positions and constructed by lived experiences. As a concept, lived experiences is now used by a lot of researchers in the field of gender and sexuality. It might not be a commonality, I think, yet, but I do think that this way of seeing is part of what could be a distinction. The study of lived experiences in relation to gender, sexuality, and media, and even communication, I think, for that matter, could benefit from the use of affect theory. Some of us already use it, but it's not a commonality. Scholars like Marta Nussbaum, Sarah Ahmed, Anna Czeskovic deal with how we can look at emotions and understand the knowledge and potentiality they hold. As the others are always the bearers of emotions, emotions are a way of seeing. Emotions as a lens of sociality, as Sarah Ahmed puts it. Ahmed argues that emotions define the relations between bodies, meaning people or objects, by sticking in or to them in two different ways. First, emotions stick to some people more than others because different emotions are associated to different people. This can be due to stereotypes. For example, the trope of the hysterical woman. Secondly, emotions are sticky to people in relation to each other. Those people who are stereotypically viewed upon as hysterical, fearsome, and so forth, become a collective, because of experiencing similar histories that stick to them. Importantly, emotions stick to people, but they cannot be located and held still. They can reproduce themselves, and this is called the sliding of emotions. This sticking and sliding of emotions have real life consequences. And in that sense, I think it's very important and meaningful to study them. There is also another level, I think, to the affect and the emotions. The question if we as researchers have an emotional bond with the subject we study, our lived experiences and affect which make us do what we do. And in short, I do think so, that this is also a distinction. Another commonality is the focus on disciplining, or the way media text, the industry, is disciplining the others. It's a focus on governmentality, or how power operates in relation to the institutions or structure to the individual. It's all about power. It has all to do with power, which of course is central in our research. Most research has been done on media policies in relation to the diversity or power imbalances in relation to media industries, and how this inequality is gendered, for example. This is also what we do, again, a distinction. We focus on power and power imbalances and inequalities. Here, I think it's important to stress the importance of also looking at the material aspect of media created by the industry. Gendered meanings are constructed through specific social and cultural practices and reified by individual actors in a specific context, but are also embedded in all kinds of material artifacts in media, which are gendered technologies, to refer to the notion of Teresa de Lauretis. Gender is produced through various technologies of gender. From a film, fiction series, a game, content on social media platforms, a news story, to digital technologies. We also need to look at the social shaping of technology, which some of us already do. Research that is already been done is mostly research on, for example, search engines. For example, research on Google, the Google search algorithm. Because it's personalized, it has consequences of creating a filter bubble, because it's confined cognitive space on finds oneself in after Google filters resulted based on the data body. It is that data which is laden with stereotypical concepts of gender and sexuality, resulting application of the technology which perpetuates this bias. Another example is the development of the one-fits-all men approach in the tech industry, where in a certain moment in time, the average new smartphone was 5.5 inches long, so it's really very big. Too big for most, between bracket, women hands, and which actually doesn't fit in pockets, for example. Or the example of speech recognition software, which was trained on recordings of male voices and only reacted and was only disciplining in relation to male authority. Or the fact that women are more likely to feel sick while wearing VR headsets. The list of gender bias is long, and research on the construction of these technologies, who are the devices which we carry, and the representation and the content, is also important to look at. But even more, we have to look behind the surface of the technology, the backhand of it all. We have to look at the interface and the structures. A few years ago, the social media platform Facebook was challenged by the protests in relation to their policy of what they call authenticity of the users. And they questioned the authenticity of, for example, drag personas online. Because of the large protest, the policy did change, including a longer list, as you can see on the slide, of options users have in relation to gender identity. A good evolution, but it's also important to study how in the backhand the processes are run. The different options we as users have in relation to gender identities and the multitudes of boxes we can tick disappear when the data are aggregated to third parties. The categories are organized and are sold in binary constructions of two examples, advertisers. I think this is very meaningful when studying gender, sexuality, and media. We also need to dive deep into the social shaping of media technologies for a full understanding, because this has also to do with power. To summarize, This quote of Donna Haraway says it all. Technology is not neutral. We're inside of what we make, and it's inside of us. We're living in a world of connections, and it matters which ones get made and unmade. Besides the object of study, the study of the practice of othering, the study of the other, besides the focus on identity and power, we often do have an emotional bond with the topic or the subject. It is often also a lived experience. The research lenses are diverse and deal with gender in a sense that it's related to other biological differences, or it deals with gender as social constructions. It deals with sexuality as fixed or as fluid, but all relate to the question of power and the other. And this comes with emotions and affect. What makes us do what we do? But it has also to do with a sense of justice, of morality maybe, or ethics, and the need to reimagine the world. What connects us in all our diversity is this framework of knowledge: the object, the other, othering, identity, power, lived experience, and affect. The sense of justice could be best, I think, conceptualized as care, the ethics of care. How are we let in, for example, in relation to when we do research of media users? How do you relate to the object of study? The ethics of care is around from the 1980s and was developed by feminists and environmentalists. And it's a normative ethical theory that holds moral action in the center, which a focus on interpersonal relationships and care. I think this perspective is often around in research on gender and sexuality, but it's not that much outspoken. We do care about what we study and try to approach the topic and the people, the subject, with care. So to conclude, this is what makes us do what we do, and what the field distinct from other research areas. The question of distinction has to do with a question of identity and belonging. So where do we belong? Let's start a conversation. Let's start to talk with the words of the organizers. Let's talk. Thank you.